but you guys welcome. This will be the second time we attempt to start this. Got to experience our first Zoom hack slash attack. That was great. Today's guest is someone who's very hard to research online. So this is going to be a very revealing interview, hopefully, because there's just not a whole lot of information out there or content, or she's hiding it very well. But what I could find, a partner at Glass Rev, she is a sommelier, a level 4 WSET. She's pursuing her Master of Wine certificate. She's a passionate sommelier of wine and spirits for the everyday drinker. Today's guest is Jane Campbell. Jane, thank you so much for weathering the children of America with all their horrible language and being here with us tonight. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you. That was certainly interesting. So it's a good way to start a meeting, I think.
Yeah, no kidding. So I'm gonna work with Phil later, and we're gonna figure out how to get back at these kids. So like I said, there's just not a whole lot of information, interviews, or anything like that out there on you, which I thought was surprising because Glassrev does so much cool stuff, with the whether it's Amrut, the Mahone Gin, the Blackadder, La Madre, Rum Runner, the list goes on and on and on. And so really the question I have for you is, what's your story? How did you get to this point? Where did it start? I mean, obviously, there's a ton of education that has gone into this, but what are kind of the origins of Jane Campbell in this industry?
Okay, good question. Thank you. So I like to fly under the radar. That's what I like to do. So basically, so I'm a Canadian, and back in, call it 2004, my husband and I, Bill and I, who lived in Toronto, Ontario at the time, decided we were fed up with city life and big city life. And so we sold our house. Bill had a business, he sold it. I quit my job and we moved out west to Alberta, to a place where you might know called Banff, on the Rockies. And when we got there, we really didn't have a plan. We just wanted to basically start a second life. And background on that is that for about 10 years, I had been avidly collecting wine, and Bill had avidly been collecting whiskey. So it made total sense then to buy a TV station, which is what we did. So we bought right? So we bought a small local TV station called Resort TV. And the idea of this was to promote local businesses. So in our quest to do this, we were seeking out hosts that would guide people through that experience. And as a result of holding auditions, we met a man who used to write wine articles, wine reviews for the local paper. And so we became friends. Long story, we ended up starting a wine club. And so the idea was that every time we got together, we would invite different couples. And so one of the couples they invited was someone who was already in this business. And then after several times of meetings together and too much alcohol, this guy was already in the business and the company wasn't doing very well. So we all decided one night to buy the business. And that's pretty much how it happened. So that was back in 2004. So we were only doing Canada and we were only doing wine. And then the first whiskey we brought in was called Writer's Tears Irish whiskey. That's in the US now, so you may be familiar with that one.
Yep.
And we did super well with that whiskey. And then what happened was Amrut at the time, so Amrut launched in Glasgow in Scotland in 2004. So this is around 2007. They were now looking to be in North America, but they thought Canada was the perfect kind of first step. And Alberta is an easy entry province. There's basically, it's an open system, so it's really easy to bring product there. And they actually approached our competitor, who turned them down but recommended us. And that's how we started importing Amrut in Canada. And that was back in 2007, 8. And then that's it since then. So then the only reason we moved to the US is they expressed an interest to come into the US. And we had done so well with them in Canada that we started talking. And we happened to have a friend who lived in the US by the name of Raj Sabharwal, which most people on this call are very familiar with. And to just go back a long time, Raj has been a long-time friend of, like, I don't know, 30 some years. And we had, been to Scotland together. We drank many, many whiskeys together. And a long time before that, we'd all sat together and said, wouldn't it be nice to be in the whiskey business? And basically, so then we phoned Raj up and said, hey, we want to be in the whiskey business. And that's how we launched in the US. So that's really how it all progressed. And here we are 15 years later.
That's pretty awesome. I mean, the TV station definitely sounds like the natural transition for anybody with those kind of collections. But you guys have this really esoteric offerings that kind of have these like really fiercely loyal people to it. Whether it be like the Mahone Gin or the Blackadder.
Mm-hmm.
How are you guys like able to acquire those types of brands? I mean, is it something that you guys are seeking out, or do people kind of look at what you've done and they come to you with those items?
It's a little bit of both in this business, as Sam knows for sure, and Chris. But I think part of our very core at the base was we want to represent products that we want to drink ourselves, that we're proud to represent. We want authenticity. We want products that have a story. We want interesting things. All of us are foodies and obviously drinkies. And so that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to have like a match for what that was. And so we're constantly seeking out these interesting, authentic products that deliver really good juice.
Hmm. Yeah, that's well. I mean, I think you guys are succeeding in that way. I think that's really cool. And there obviously wasn't a whole lot of information on you. So again, congratulations on somehow flying under the radar in the in time of information. But one of the things that jumped out to me just with like the Glass Rev is, you have your lineup of all the stuff that you guys are importing and getting out to your distributors, but then you also have these limited brands that you do, and then you have like almost kind of like a cask program for people as well, or at least that's what your website says. So I was curious, more like what's kind of like the motivation behind the limited brands? Is it kind of like a trial period to see like, hey, let's see if this works, but not overcommit to them? And then after that, if you could talk a little bit about like the cask program too, if that's what that's kind of entails and what you guys have done in the past with it.
Right. Well, the limited brands are oftentimes because there's only a limited supply. So they're smaller distributors who are not able to produce mass quantities. And so as a result of that, you get a very limited amount of product either every year and so that's really the basis of that. So we feel that kind of keeps the portfolio interesting and fresh and new. And then the cask program is really come to light since we've picked up Murray McDavid, because the ACO has about 9,000 casks in reserve. So now we have the opportunity to offer some pretty cool things to people on an ongoing basis. And a lot of clubs or a lot of some chains or restaurants, they want to do their own thing. So they want a one-off, they want a unique point of sales, right? They want something unique to offer to their customer. And so this gives them the opportunity to bring something in that's unique and that really is one of a kind.
So then with like the limited,
that's really
and with like a limited selection, it's kind of like properly setting those expectations for everybody as well. Be like, hey, we said it was limited, so you can't be mad at us that
Yeah.
it's out right now.
Well, it's kind of like, for instance, Blackadder, right? So we bring in whatever, an offering, and there may be 300 bottles in existence, and we might get 120 or 180 of them, and once they're gone, they're gone. So there's a beauty in that, when the customer discovers such a great whiskey, they get a great experience. The sad thing about it is, if you really love that dram, it's not coming back. So if you find, for instance, a Blackadder that you truly love that's limited and it's a single cask, then buy 3 bottles if you love it, because it's not going to be here again. And that's just how it goes. So
Right.
it's great for explorers, people who love to explore and who love to try new things. It's a little bit challenging for those who love to drink the same thing all the time.
Yeah.
Right.
Actually,
And the same taste profile.
okay. And actually, that is kind of give me a question for you, because it's Blackadder is not for the faint of heart at all. And I really have loved a lot of the expressions that I've had. I mean, I've definitely picked up a few of the rum offerings that I've been able to get my hands on over the past couple of years. And I'm just curious with your experience with it, when you're talking to buyers and consumers, and you are talking about like something like the raw cask, that has this gnarly pieces in it, and everything in most consumers' minds is like, if there's something in there, there's something wrong with it, and I'm curious to see how you approach that, and what you say to those people when it comes to be like, oh, don't worry about it, it's just little bits of wood, it's fine, it'll go right down.
Well, part of it is we made a strategic decision, I guess, a little while back, that we had a few returns from customers saying there's something off about this bottle. And then we started to say, no, this whiskey is so unique, it needs to be placed in a store or a restaurant where the person understands that this is the raw cask, that this is actually bits of charcoal from the barrel that's left in the bottle, and therefore can talk about the fact that it's had minimal filtering, and therefore, as a result, all the congeners and esters, they're all still in there. All the taste profile is really in there. So we try. So if you will, the distribution of that kind of product is very limited, and it's to selected people.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I even to some of like my more hardcore guys, like I show them that stuff, and they're a little caught off guard by those pieces and stuff.
And yet, as you know, once they get hooked on it, it's a love affair. It continues.
Yeah. I'm on like my second or third raw cask, so I 100% fall into that category. I mean, I wasn't as scared at the beginning, but I was definitely a little kind of like, oh boy, and then I definitely fell into that. Robert had a question, was wondering, on the Blackadder, are they typically bringing the entire cask for importation?
So we sometimes get a full cask, but he has very limited supply. And basically, Europe gets a little bit of it, Japan gets some, and we get some. And there's a tiny bit in Canada. And those are really the only locations that get Blackadder. So we hardly ever get a full cask, get the entire cask. It gets divided between those 4 markets.
And then Phil had the question, was the raw cask a problem with TTB on the label itself?
No.
No. Okay.
No, why? No. I guess that's the short answer.
Well, I mean, just sometimes with the TTB, it's they somehow manifest problems out of nowhere. So I can understand the question. It's like, hey, it says raw on it. There's bits and pieces floating around. There's just like, what's the formula for that?
No, because it's a single malt. We haven't had a problem. we had more problem actually registering Amrut as a single malt because that was just not done. They didn't want to, they really resisted that single malt whiskey on the label. They didn't want that because it wasn't from Scotland. So that was a real challenge for us. It took us a long time. I think we had to resubmit 2 or 3 times to finally get approval for that. So
Wow.
I understand the weirdness. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no,
the weirdness of that.
totally. And you know, before we move on from Blackadder, I you know, in the time that you've been working for it, you know, or working with it, what's one of your favorites from that lineup that you just like when you taste, you're like, this is just unreal?
I will have to say this. First of all, I've never had a bad Blackadder, so I will say that all of them have been enjoyable. But last year they released a Springbank 17-year-old heavily sherried. I don't know if any of that went to California. Maybe somebody knows, but it was like black ink, and it was scrumptious. I mean, there's no words to describe it. It was amazing. So that's, I think, the one that stands out the most for me.
Okay, I have to track that one down. And
Sam
you
would
know,
know if you got some, I think.
and you know, just for, you know, obviously there's a lot of ambition that goes into wanting to be an importer, and probably more so when it comes to bringing in quote unquote weird stuff that people aren't used to seeing. And you know, what's part of that motivation that kind of keeps you guys going and keeps you finding, you know, those weird offerings to bring to the US? I mean, I know you talked about, you know, we want to bring things that we enjoy drinking, but obviously there's an element of like,
Yeah.
you know, like there's a monetary element too, where you have to be like, okay, well, I still got to pay my bills and stuff and got to eat. So,
Sure.
you know,
Yeah.
I'm curious what that motivation ends up being.
Well, I think for us, I think there's a lot of people like us out in the world. People who are seeking the unique, seeking the authentic, seeking the unusual, thinking and experience. And so I think that's the motivation. It's like you can drink Crown Royal, Jack Daniels all day, all night. Everybody's drinking that. But what about those people who don't want that, who want the unique experience? And that's what drives us to keep searching for these very interesting spirits.
Yeah. Do you have any situations that you can recall where you either had somebody really enjoy it, or you guys were able to sell something that somebody told you that you wouldn't be able to, that you're kind of like, yeah, I was right, and you guys should have listened? You know, any situations where you can recall like that?
Sorry, ask that question again.
So if there was ever
cut out a little bit.
If there was ever a moment when you were kind of validated for having those feelings, you know, that you can think of specifically, like where you know, bringing in an Indian
Well,
single
I'll
malt.
take Amrut.
Yeah. Okay.
So here, when we first started selling Amrut, I'll tell you the story in Canada. So go back to 2007, 2008. Really, world single malt had not really come. I mean, Japanese was kind of just emerging as a brand, and maybe it had already emerged in the US, but Canada's always 5 years behind. So when we first started pouring Amrut, people were like I remember going to shows where we would do these massive shows, 15,000 attendees over 3 days. And, you know, you would start pouring and people go, single malt from India. You guys are crazy. Like nothing good comes out of India was always the first response. And then they would drink it and then they would go, wow, this is really interesting. And then you'd tell them the story. And then they would leave your table, and then next thing you know, they would come back with 2 friends, and then they would come back with 2 friends. But there was so much skepticism for so long. And then until finally, like I remember the craziest, this is one of many, but one of the first times when I thought, oh, we're making a difference, is I was actually at an event, and it was supposed to be a small event, like 1,000 attendees. So I went by myself. I was the only one pouring at the table. And there was a lineup. I was only pouring 3 SKUs of Amrut, and there was a lineup of 50 people at my table, always, like consistently for 3 hours. And at one point, I ran out of whiskey. I had to go get more. And I said to the organizer, you have to stand behind here and tell people, like, I'll be right back. And he was like, I'm going to get, like, they're going to, you know, attack me because they want this whiskey. And it was the craziest show. So it went from, we couldn't get anybody to drink it to, oh my God, there's only one lineup in this entire event and it's me. So so that was kind of, you know what, there you go. It's a good whiskey, no matter where it comes from.
That's cool. And really that's the perfect segue into, you know, kind of the next part of this conversation, and really trying to have a focus on Amrut tonight and everything that kind of goes into it. So I guess it would be a scenario, kind of start at as much as information as you want to share with Amrut with us. Let's do that. So we start at the beginning, the origins of Amrut, and then I know you have some slides as well you want me to tell with us.
Oh, sure. So Amrut is a distillery that was established in Bangalore, India, in 1948. So initially, they actually were a blending facility, not a distillery. And so they did that for a couple of years until they started to distill rum. And so, I don't know if you can see this. So the first thing they actually did was the Amrut Old Port rum. Can you see it?
Yeah.
And this is still here. So they started distilling this in 1950. It's made of 100% molasses from Indian sugarcane. So India is the second largest area planted with sugarcane in the world. Brazil is number one, India is number two. So it made sense that their first distillate would be molasses-based distillate. And then from there it grew. So they make a lot of what is called IMFL, so Indian made foreign liquor, which essentially is molasses-based neutral spirit that's blended with either a grain whiskey or Scotch or single malt. So they had been importing single malt from Scotland for a long time, making this IMFL. Because as you know, India is the biggest, largest whiskey drinkers in the world, right? So people say, well, yes, but they have 1.5 billion population, but and they drink 1.5 billion liters per year, but 80% of the population doesn't drink. But the other 20%, they drink a lot.
They compensate for that.
So they compensate for that. I think I read somewhere that the average adult male in India drinks 30 liters of alcohol, of spirit per year. So that's a fair amount of spirit. You know, that's like half a bottle every week. So they still make a lot of that IMFL, and they also make brandy for the Indian market. And then in 1987, they decided they wanted to actually start making their own malted single malt instead of importing it from Scotland. So they started to experiment making single malt. And then they ended up with a bit of a surplus. And then at that time, so this is a family-run business, so it was passed down to Neil, and his son is Rick. So Rick was actually in university with Ashok, who you may have heard that name, Ashok Chokalingham.
Yep.
And so they were in university together. And so part of Rick's thesis was the viability of introducing single malt to the world as a business practice. So he did develop that thesis, and him and Ashok had become good friends. And so they were hired, they started working, they started experimenting, they started developing, and they finally launched the brand in 2004. And they launched it where it made the most sense, Scotland. And so, of course, the Scots were like, what are you, nuts? Do you know what we do here? Like, we actually make single malt. You think we're going to drink this Indian single malt? So it was very, very difficult at the beginning. So Ashok was, if you will, charged with launching that in Europe and in the UK. And in, I think about the first 6 years, he drove 300,000 miles. He basically wore down almost 3 vehicles, just going from door to door. And if you listen to Ashok talk about his stories, he'll say, you know, I used to go to people and say, hey, I have this Indian single malt, and the shops in Europe would be just like laughing at him, going, forget it, we don't want him here. So they started putting the whiskey into blind tasting alongside Scottish whiskeys. And guess what? They started winning. They started getting chosen. They started getting all these good reviews. And then finally, their break came in 2010 when Jim Murray rated the Amrut Fusion 97 points, named it the third best whiskey in the world. And then that's when really it turned around and people started really kind of appreciating Indian single malt. And so since then, it's just been an upward trajectory. Yeah, really fantastic. And right now they just can't make enough whiskey to supply the demand that they have. Nice problem to have.
Yeah, that's definitely a good problem. Frustrating as a salesperson, as I'm sure you know.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
a very, very good problem to have.
Yeah.
So can you speak to the process? I know that they're following, you know, a lot of the Scotch practices when it comes to the production, but
Yep.
you know, where are some of like the big differentiating factors? You know, so you have the base, but then where does it kind of really go in its own direction?
Right. So there's a few factors that make, even though they're following the exact same process as Scottish single malt. So it is 100% malted barley. It is with yeast and water, and that's it. It's aged for a minimum of 3 years, so you can call it whiskey. But the main differences are this. One is they use a different barley strain. So in India, it's a 6-row barley versus 2-row barley that they use in Scotland. So what does that mean? It just means that the grains are smaller, it's a lower yield, there's more protein and starch in the barley, and therefore that imparts more of a kind of an oiliness, a little bit more sweetness to the whiskey. Secondly, they do a longer fermentation than Scotland. So they ferment 4 to 5 days, Scotland about 3 days. And so that again brings out more of the sweetness and more of the kind of dried fruit notes into the whiskey. And then finally, the temperature difference is a huge factor in what happens with Indian whiskey. So if you think about it, Scotland is cold, wet most of the year. India is hot and dry. So Bangalore is at 3,000 feet, so it's drier than a lot of India. They have a huge diurnal range, so it can be, call it in the morning, it might be, I'm thinking Celsius, 15 Celsius. So it could be like 60 degrees, but then by 1 o'clock, it's 85 degrees. And then again, it goes back down. And they have a pretty steady year-round same temperature. So what that means is that the barrels contract and expand a lot more than say in Scotland. And as a result, the whiskey gets more from the wood. And also as a result of that heat, there's a lot more evaporation. So the age share in India is super high. It's first year is 14%, and then it settles down at a cool 10 to 12%. If you think of Scotland, they're allowed to write off 2%, but it's probably lower than that. So that means the whiskey is aging much quicker and is getting a lot more from the wood and from the environment. So as a result, you get this beautiful spiciness, richness, oiliness, almost bourbon-like qualities to the whiskey, which makes that very, very unique.
Interesting. So when they made that decision to start like making this whiskey and all these factors start playing in, when they were doing the rum, were they using column stills? And then now, I mean, are they still using column stills for that? And then did they just build copper pots, or how did that all work out? Like, what's the distillation differences between the rum that they were producing, still are producing, and then now with the whiskey? Is it all done the same way?
Well, they do two rums. The two Indies rum.
Yep.
So this is done in a column still. The two Indies is also done because it's done with jaggery. It's done in a copper still, and then they installed copper stills for the single malt. So that's um, a separate, if you will. They specifically did something very specific for the single malt. So yeah, so they followed Scotland copper pot still. Basically, they're around the same as you would with a copper pot. They probably have a longer neck. That's probably the biggest difference that they did. But yeah, so they're all very, very separate distillation methods.
And do you know how big the?
Because remember,
I was going to ask that. Do you know how big the whiskey stills are? I don't care about stuff like that, but I get asked it all the time. I don't know why it matters to people.
The copper pot.
Yeah.
So there's 6,000 liters, and they installed last year. They built a new distillery. So before they had one still, and now they installed two more. So they went from being basically able to make 300,000 liters a year to now being able to make 900,000 liters a year, maybe pushing to 1 million of single malt specifically. So, yeah.
And, one thing that I run into, and I'm curious to know if you run into the same thing, but, we have some of, I think the IMFL whiskeys in our collection as well. And it's like this really kind of weird dance that I have to do with some of my buyers where, they'll look at something like Royal Challenge and be like, give me 10 cases of that. And then they'll turn around and be like, oh, Amrut. I was like, yeah, it's another Indian single malt. They're like, that's not Indian whiskey or whatever like that. Is Amrut, I mean, is there a customer base for it in India, or have you found that the customer base really exists outside of India?
For the single malt, initially they didn't even sell it in India because they just didn't have enough. And you guys experienced that because I think we're one of the first distributors in the U.S. to carry Amrut. We were constantly out of stock. There just was not enough stock. And so it was about only 5 years ago they started to sell in India. And now, literally, if they release like 1,000 cases in one of the states or 2,000 cases, it's gone within 2 hours. So huge demand for it now in India, for sure. But at the time, they just didn't have enough to sell. And so their position was, we want to create a world-class single malt that competes with world-class single malts. And that's why they didn't release it in India. They wanted a global business, if you will.
Yeah. So now they are selling in
yeah.
India, but I mean, this could be completely, and I don't know if this would be privy to this, but do you know the percentages between like, 20% staying back in India, 80% goes to export, or do you have any ideas of what that number might look like?
I'm not sure what the percentage is, but that's probably about right. India gets a very small market because, now that they've been established they're in 42 countries now, by the way. So they want to make sure they have enough supply for all of those countries.
Oh, okay.
And as you know, right now, all the distilleries in India are shut down, right? 100% shut because of coronavirus. So, and they're making hand sanitizer for their state. But thankfully, we had a good supply secured before. But yeah, so I think they're reopening in a few weeks there right now. 2 more weeks or something before they reopen.
Yeah, let's hope it happens sooner than later. So still getting some questions about the rums, but
Oh yeah.
What's the percentage of the two different rums between like column and copper pot? And do you know like what their blending methods are?
So the Old Port rum is 100% column distilled
Okay.
rum. The Two Indies rum is actually 8% of the copper pot rum, which is made in India from jaggery. You guys know what jaggery is? Yeah. Have you ever seen jaggery?
I
You
have
want to see
not.
how it's made? You guys want to see how it's made? I'll show you how it's made. It's very cool because that's very, very unique to India. Let me see if I can share my screen. Yeah, here we go. Sorry, you're seeing that?
Yep.
So, yeah, so here you go. So there's the Two Indies rum. And basically, it's a family-owned sugarcane field that they have. So just harvest, juice the cane. Then they start with a boiling process. So that kind of starts the evaporation until basically the cane juice thickens. And then once it's thickening, it even starts to crystallize like a sugar. And then all of the excess moisture is squeezed out by hand. And then you end up with this big lump of sugar. And that's what they use for the distillate. So next year, actually this coming year, we'll be launching 100% jaggery rum. And then this rum is distilled in a very tiny actually still. And then that's aged for about 3 years. And in the Two Indies rum, then that is blended with some Caribbean rum. So Guyana, Barbados, and Jamaica. And that's actually a blend that they get that was chosen by the owner, Neil, when he was still alive. And because his concept was he wanted to bring together East and West, West Indies to make this beautiful kind of rum that represents both cultures.
Can you spell the jaggery for us?
Jaggery? Yeah, Jaggery.
Okay.
Jaggery.
I didn't want to
If
make the
you
assumption that it was
taste
that
it,
easy. So.
yeah, no, it is. But if you taste it, it's like it's almost like a malted fermented sugar. It's a really weird little taste, and it's not as sweet as say a normal white sugar would be. I brought this back from India actually when I was there.
Do you know if there's like does any jaggery make it to like Indian marketplaces here in the United States? Do you know if that's even a thing?
I'm sure they do. I know that one year I think we were at a restaurant with Summer, and the restaurant owner, we were at an Indian restaurant, and he came out with one of the balls and gave us some pieces of it. So I know that it's available somewhere in the U.S. for sure.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Yes, Drew, it's called Royal Challenge.
Okay.
What
I am actually not completely joking.
Is Royal Challenge made out of jaggery?
Whiskey.
Yes, there is some in it, and they call it whiskey, but it's not really whiskey.
Interesting. Huh.
Well, it's a blend, right? Because doesn't it not have the molasses base plus some grain whiskey in it?
It does, but it does have jaggery in it as well.
Mm.
Oh, that is
did not know that.
super interesting. Well, hey, that's what these virtual happy hours are all about. You know,
That's
little
cool.
kids and bad words and learning new things. That's what we do here at Drew's virtual happy hour.
So, Jane, when you have the rums and you're blending them for the Two Indies, so they're already a finished product and then they're blended together. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, so they do the jaggery separately, and they import this other, it's already blended. It's blended for them. And it was kind of a combination that Neil chose when he was creating this product. And then when it gets to India, then it's blended and it sits in oak for about 6 months again, just, just to meld the flavors, if you will.
So I assume it comes from probably the UK, correct?
I don't know the answer to the question.
I'm pretty sure it comes from the UK, because those are the only people that I can think of who would be blending these rums as a finished product and then sending it. It's not a bad thing. I'm just curious.
Yeah. No, you know what? I will find out for you because I actually don't know the answer to the question. I've never asked that question.
Yeah, it's probably maybe an EA shear or something like that.
No doubt.
Yeah.
Highly possible.
That is actually really fascinating. I need to crack open that 2 Indies rum bottle and dive back into that. And
you know what? I love to say this is cheap enough to blend, but good enough to sip. So you can easily have it in a cocktail because it's not expensive, but on its own, it's a great sipping rum. It's just really very beautiful and not too sweet, and just a really beautiful sipping rum.
Now, do you know, is there any post distillation additives that are put into it, whether it be sugar or color or anything like that? None?
No, nothing.
Okay.
None.
All right. Awesome. Okay, so we got sidetracked with the rum. Go figure.
That's rum. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
But so bringing it back to kind of the whiskey part of it, and you kind of touched on a little bit earlier with the spectrum, but one thing that Amrut is notorious for is absolutely the innovation when it comes to barreling. And I would just, what has been your impression, of the guys, and why that has become something that's been so important to them, and why they wanted to do this traditional single malt, to the Scottish styles, but then they're but when it comes to barreling, we're turning it on its head. How did that kind of come about for them?
Well, I think part of it is they wanted to follow the Scottish standards to create a world-class whiskey, but they're not bound by the rules of Scotland in a way. So in India, there's right now really no standard for single malt, although the distilleries who are exporting kind of have, had many conversations together about keeping the quality high so that, India becomes associated with high quality whiskey. But part of it is just they didn't want to do Scotland. They wanted to do Indian single malt. So make it India. And if you've eaten Indian food, you know that their specialty is this ability to create multi-layered flavor profiles within one dish. And they do that by many spices in the dish. So they tried to kind of layer the whiskey in the same way. So that's why, they did, I think they were the first when they did intermediate sherry. They were the first to say, well, let's put it in a bourbon cask and then in the sherry cask and then back to the bourbon cask. That kind of stuff hadn't been done. And a lot of the larger distilleries, if you will, they're not as nimble as Amrut is in terms of experimentation. And because the whiskey ages 3.5 to 4 times faster than it does in Scotland, it allows them that flexibility to innovate because they can try a small batch and in 3 to 4 years know if it's going to be good. They don't have to wait 20 years or 30 years before the product is out. So that gives them that freedom to just try a lot of different things. And they're just very creative. They just wanted to carve a different lane, if you will. Somewhat, again, like Chris was talking about yesterday, Japanese rice whiskey, it's a different lane, right? It's not the same as Scotland. It's just an expansion of that marketplace.
Yeah. Oh, that's really cool. One question that I get a lot from people is the Spectrum ever going to come back?
Yes, it is. So I have one last bottle here, the beautiful one. Look at the color. Wow. Can you
That's
see it?
insane.
How dark that is? Isn't that insane how dark that is?
Yeah, that's very cool.
Yeah. So that could be the last one. This is batch number 1, which was released 2017. So it is coming back. I believe we will get some in 2021. So what's happening with the limited releases is they only release, 2 or 3 of the different expressions every year, and then they circulate. So for instance, I believe you have Narangi in stock. So that one was here last year. It's not coming back now, probably till 2022 or 2023. Now we still have Canamom again, which is another really weird whiskey that they've aged consecutively in 5 different casks. That's here now. It's not going to come back for 4 or 5 years. Intermediate sherry, forget it. If you can find one of those, good luck. Porta Nova, again, not in the foreseeable future. So these are just, they release them and then they start on the next batch, but it takes, 4 or 5 years for them to age it. So yeah, so probably 2021 we'll get more.
Very cool. So you mentioned one of my favorite weird expressions that they had done, which was the Narangi. And for the people on the call that don't exactly know what the process was, could you explain what they did? Because every time I hear it, I still just don't believe it. And I just love hearing the story because it's nuts.
It is nuts. So if you look at the whiskey again, and you can see that color, that's a very orange color, correct?
Yeah.
So again, they wanted to make, because they felt that Indian whiskey lends itself very well to kind of like these citrus notes because of the spices and with the cask. But they wanted to do a single malt. And as you know, the Scotland EU regulation says if you add anything into a whiskey, you can no longer call it a whiskey. So they found a way around that where they could still call it a whiskey by treating the cask. So first they aged the normal single malt in an ex-bourbon for about 3 years. Then they got their hands on some Oloroso sherry casks, kept them full of Oloroso sherry, brought them to India, and then they dumped in each cask about 4 to 5 kilos of orange peels. And the oranges are specific to India. They're called Coorg. I may not be saying that right. Coorg oranges, which grow about 100 kilometers, so 80 miles south of Bangalore. So they dumped that in the cask with the sherry for 2 years. They let it sit there, and so all of the oils from the peel, if you will, leach on to the cask and the sherry with the sherry. Then after 2 years, they dumped that out and they poured the already aged bourbon in a next bourbon cask into that sherry cask for 3 more years. And then, bam, out came this beautiful Narangi. So it's got these amazing orange notes and sweetness, but not overpowering, just really all integrated into the whiskey.
Yeah, that's so.
And then that was named World Whiskey of the Year. Yeah.
That's such a cool whiskey. So the question, actually, one of our retailers, he was just wondering if you ever foresee like the price point ever dropping on Indian whiskey. It's been one of the struggles that he's had to try to move things like Amrut. It's just it's expensive and it's unknown. So he understands there's value, but with Indian whiskey, that has been a huge challenge as a consumer does not want to purchase if they talk about how India does not have any laws that protect the standards and stuff like that. Because people are maybe used to seeing like Royal Challenge or something like that. They're like, well, they're kind of doing this crazy stuff and calling it whiskey.
Yeah.
But I mean, do you anticipate anything like that happening where there might be standards put onto Indian whiskeys? And then in terms of price, do you ever foresee that those prices coming down at all. Especially now that they have more stills,
Well,
like maybe production
yeah.
ramping up, you know?
The problem with that, so imagine, so the problem with Indian whiskey and the pricing, if you will, is because they lose so much to evaporation. So if you think about the amount they lose after, so let's say the fusion, for instance, here, the fusion is about 5.5 years old. Well, within 5 years, they've already lost half their cask. So even though they might ramp up production, they still have the same challenges of the angel share being so greedy. You know, Ashok likes to say in Scotland, the angels come down, they open the bung of the barrel and they dip their little finger in and they taste it and then they fly away. But in India, they take the bung out, put their straw in and they start sucking. And so as a result, the barrel just starts going down tremendously. And so that's always going to be the challenge because of the high evaporation rate. They're following the same standards as Scotland. So yes, for instance, Royal Challenge is not called single malt whiskey. So it's like saying, well, it's a blended Scotch or it's a single malt, right? They're two different beasts. So part of that, I guess, is educating the customer, and I understand it's a challenge, and because of the fact that there's no real age statements on the whiskeys, but knowing that 1 year of aging in India is about 3.5 years in Scotland. So your 5.5-year-old fusion is equivalent to an 18-year-old. So I don't think I have a satisfactory answer for that question because I don't really think the price will go down.
No, Jane,
Not by a lot.
Yeah. No, Jane, I really appreciate that answer, right? Like, that's like the same thing as being a retailer, right? Like, I got to look at it from a bunch of different perspectives. Like, how do we sell it to the consumer? And that's the same thing that we run into with Garrison Brothers bourbon that's out of Texas, right? Texas is much hotter, and then they're a high price versus a bourbon that's coming out of Kentucky. But the thing is, people still have that trust level with that Texas bourbon coming out and believe that story, right? The minute I start telling them the story about this Indian whiskey, the biggest challenge that becomes is that they're like, okay, everything that comes out of India is cheap, right? And like, how come the whiskey is so expensive? And I think there's that whole part of education. And I think one of the things that I personally talked to Drew about is that I know Indian whiskey is becoming hot, and you know, some of the statistics that we've seen last year is that some of the most sold whiskey in the world was Indian whiskey. And when people see those statistics, they want to taste and they want to hear that story from, you know, like they want to hear that. And that's where I'm having a struggle, is that how do you tell that story? Either I'm not doing a great way justice to it by telling a great story, but like that's been my challenge, is that I sell a lot of whiskey and I do really good with the whiskey consumer. And that has been one category that I have just struggled completely a lot, right? Like it's just, I can't sell, get them to pay that price point.
Yeah, I think so. Are you allowed to do tasting in stores?
Yeah.
Because the other way to handle it is to have a bottle and say, you know, don't talk so much about the India, but to say, here, let me give you something, you know, what do you like to drink? Here, try this whiskey, see how you like it, and then go back and tell the story. Because once people taste the quality of it, they go, this blows my mind, right? Yeah. But that perception of, I think, you know, I've been struggling with this, for 15 years, because I've had that same response that you're getting. And part of it is to get the liquid to the lips, to say, all right, well, try this and tell me that's not fantastic. Because I've never, well, maybe I have, but 95%, 97% of the time when you put someone's lips to this, they are astounded by the quality of the liquid.
Yeah.
So that could be a little trick that you try.
Yeah, no, that's the only thing that we haven't tried yet, but like that has been the biggest struggle for me, right? Like it's I've had Narangi
Yeah,
on the shelf, right? And people have come in and
yeah,
they've seen the write-ups on it and they've seen all the accolades that the Narangi's winning all over the world, and everybody's like, oh, this is great stuff, and they
yeah,
go, oh, Rose, so this, and these are guys that are spending like one of the guys that literally just like 30 minutes ago just came in and bought a $500 bottle of Irish whiskey. And he's the same guy.
right,
He looks at it. He's that Narangi's still on the shelf. Like it's like I want to buy it, but I just don't know about it. And it's like that's where
yeah,
I feel is like you're buying a $600 bottle of whiskey, so the price is not the problem, but it's just like, why do you not see the value? And that's where I'm struggling, is why these consumers are not seeing the value in it. And that's the part that, that confuses me for the Indian whiskey, is like, why do you not see the value?
mm, yeah. And honestly, I mean, I think Amrut is probably one of the most awarded distilleries, certainly world whiskeys. It's one of the most awarded distilleries, I believe, that exists. And like, I want to say Fusion has already gotten, I don't know, 28 international awards, not little awards, mom and pop, but, world recognition awards. And so, yeah, there's a perception there, but I think your best bet is liquid to lips. You got to try it and go, wow, this is fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, in doing things like this, where telling some of those stories from somebody with that firsthand experience, it helps. So like these are
Yeah,
things that hopefully both Ro and I will be able to convey to those people in our market, and kind of be like, hey, like we understand it's aggressive, but here are the reasons why, and stuff like that. And it actually does remind me, one of the questions I wanted to ask you was about the Greedy Angels bottle. That's the
right.
one of the few bottles that actually does carry an age statement from Amrut. And I'm just curious,
Yeah,
like over the course of its aging process, which I believe is 10 years,
yeah.
what do they estimate the barrel loss was on something like that?
About 80%.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So if you think about it, after 5 years, they've lost half the barrel, and then another 5 years, it goes down dramatically from there. And so again, that's another reason why that one is so, expensive, because whatever you started with, you barely got anything left. So yeah, about 80% they lose.
Yeah, and I noticed that
Beautiful journey.
yeah, we're gonna have the option to get two or potentially two different ones, where there's one that's in a bourbon cask and the other one is in a rum cask.
Correct.
Do you
So
do you know where they source their
this is
cask
the
from?
one in the rum cask. So the rum cask is their own 100% Jaggery rum.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. And then the bourbon cask come from either Buffalo Trace, Heaven Hills, or Jack Daniels. And actually, Ashok's favorite cask to use are those from Jack Daniels. So more than likely, it's a Jack Daniels cask.
Is that just because of how he feels that their barrels react to his whiskey?
Yes. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. He just feels there's a great match there, and so he loves those. He loves those casks.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
Do you know of any projects that they're currently working on that you're allowed to tell us about that might be like super cool or anything?
Oh, well, I'm not allowed to tell you. I do know there's a couple coming that are pretty interesting.
Okay.
And they don't want us to release it yet, but yes, there are some very interesting things coming, at least 2 in the coming year. And you have an interesting product there too, the single grain.
Yeah.
So
yes.
the single grain is the first time they've ever released a single grain. And actually, it's a new make that was offered to them by another distillery. So it's not their own whiskey. And they're allowed to do that because again, they don't have to, in Scotland, if you call it single grain, it has to be from the single distillery, but they're not bound by that. But it was purchased as new make, aged, and bottled at Amrut, and it's corn basically.
Nice. Yeah, I get really excited about all the different things that they're doing, and I definitely look forward to jumping more into the rum. I don't know. I guess I was just too dismissive of it before, but that's like such a cool story. And is the 100% Jaggery, is that something that you anticipate bringing to the U.S.?
We will get, I think we're getting 1 barrel this year. So yes, we are going to get a very limited amount.
Okay.
So, and I can't wait to taste it, honestly. Well, I tasted it when I was there, but I can't wait for the final product. So it's not quite there yet. They're still letting it age a little bit, but yeah, it's already delicious.
That's really cool. Yeah, definitely
Yeah.
have to see if I can get some of that from you as well.
Yeah.
So with kind of like one of my favorite questions to ask people is, you've had all this experience. You're kind of, you're the people that built Amrut in North America. Are there any of these expressions from them that you wish there was just an endless supply that you could drink whenever you had, like, that they might have come out with a couple of years ago, or things that you think are just really special and unique?
To this day, well, my favorite, the Narangi is one of my favorites. It's a breakfast whiskey. It's a pancake whiskey, right? You can have it with your pancakes in the morning. It's so delicious. So I would say, that's one of my favorites. And the Greedy Angels in the ex bourbon. This one is peated, so I'm not a huge peat fan. But the Greedy Angels in the bourbon cask is just like drinking like butter. It's so just goes down smooth. There's not one discordant note in the entire whiskey. So I would say those two.
Okay. Well, I think I'm gonna have to get Ro to split that Narangi bottle with me. I don't know if I'm doing well enough to split a Greedy Angel bottle yet. So we'll see.
Where
You will
are you
enjoy
based
it.
on?
I live in Las Vegas.
How about getting you out to Sacramento one of these days after this whole thing is over, like COVID thing?
I like it. I'm in.
Yeah.
Tell Drew to send me some details.
Yeah. See, one of the things
And
that
you and I can connect.
from Joshua's thing that we got out of Single Cast Nation is about, like, we do really good with barrel picks and stuff, right? So one of the things that we got out of it, in my mind, was things that that you could stand by, right? Not what the consumer wants, is the things that you can stand behind, right? Like what you think is going to be good.
Right.
That's one of the things that we want to take that as, like, we're learning and we're evolving from these happy hours, right? From different speakers.
Right.
And that's one of the things is with Indian whiskey, I feel close to it, right? Like, this is something that, hey, in Sacramento, I'm known for, like, whiskey, and then I'm Indian, and then there's Indian whiskey, and then everybody talks shit to me about Indian whiskey every day. So I'm like, God damn it. Like, there's, we make good whiskey too. So it's, and that's what I want to kind of showcase. Yeah. So that's what I want to kind of showcase that. Right. And then, I want to definitely, when this COVID is over, I want to do something where we can start doing, like something that's coming from you versus coming from me. It's totally different. Right. And that's what would love to have you come out to this territory and, do a tasting with us. Yeah.
Totally. Okay. I'm in. So yes, let's pick a date if we're ever out of house arrest.
Yeah. Yeah. One pandemic at a time, guys. Let's, we'll get there.
We can't wait.
Yeah. Does anybody else have any questions? Let's see. Jeff Nichols just typed in, who is still selling a bottle of the Blackadder Statement Edition 31? Do you know of anybody that has that?
No.
Sorry, Jeff.
I could try and find out. I could dig through and see if it's in any other territory, but I do not know the answer off the top of my head. So let me take myself a note.
Now here, this might be the biggest breakthrough of the night. If somebody does want to get a hold of you, how do they do that?
You have my email and my
I mean,
phone number.
I have it now, but do you want me just to start sharing it, put you on
Do you
blast?
want me to get?
Give you the-
Totally.
Okay, if anybody needs
my
Jane's
email
stuff,
is my email is very simple. It's just Jane Jane @glassrev.com. Super easy.
there you go. She's
So
now.
Jane, would you be open to a virtual happy hour to like a whiskey society, like if you did something like that, like in like the next couple
Totally.
months or?
It might be our
Totally.
only
Yeah.
option in California.
It's our only option right now. We had our first one for the Whiskey Society this Saturday, so we'll see how that one goes, and go from there.
Okay.
Right? Like, so.
I'll take the learnings. What went well, what didn't go so well. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, passwords.
Cool.
It's definitely password protected. I'll tell you that.
Password protect. Yeah.
Quick question,
Yeah.
Jane.
Okay, Sam.
So number one, I want to thank Ro for being a huge supporter of Amrut. I know for a fact that you're buying the 50 ml bottles and you're opening and you're putting that for your customers at no charge. So we know that we have some KGB agents there watching you. So thank you for that. Andrew, of course, thank you for advocating this brand and Glass Revolution brands in territory. Jane, Glass Revolution has a great variety of different brands to offer, Blackadder's and Hongjin, and but Amrut being kind of a jewel in this crown. That's how Raj sold me. I was like you, skeptical about Indian whiskey, but he came here many years ago and listened to his presentation. I kind of fell in love with this whiskey, and I think it's really unique. And you took us through the process of barley, 6-row barley versus 2-row barley,
Mhm.
and fermentation being longer than average in Scotland, which is great. And you touched a little bit on spirit steel and the distillation itself, but something that makes Amrut, and I understand the climate thing, but could you take us more like in detail on distillation techniques, maybe size of the stills, the configuration, because I think it has to do what makes Amrut standing out among other Indian whiskeys and maybe world whiskeys, including Scotch. There's something special about that. If you could share it with us, maybe getting into the distillation techniques, and maybe some wood program, if you could take us through, that'd be great. That's question one. I have one more, but you could take this one.
Well, I'm going to say the distillation techniques are not any different than honestly what they're doing in Scotland. The biggest difference comes from the difference in barley, the longer the fermentation. As I mentioned, the still is slightly different in terms of the neck, but they're doing exactly as they would in Scotland, but just because of how they're able, because of the weather, what I talked about, how it extracts much quicker from the barrel, all of that combination of things is what creates that unique taste profile. And if you've, you'll probably notice something very consistent amongst all of the whiskeys is that there's like those sweet honey, dried fruit notes in every expression that they do. And that's really, I think, part of the magic is those elements. So the process is the same, but it's the combination of all those other elements that makes it super unique. And, obviously barrel management, anybody in Scotland or anywhere would tell you that you have to have good a good barrel management program, because you have to know exactly when it's time to, bottle the whiskey. So part of what they have to do, so if you talk to Ashok, he will tell you that after 3 years, they feel the whiskey is fully matured. So that would be equivalent to a 10-year-old Scottish whiskey. However, they don't bottle just at 3 years. They let it go longer, but then they start to taste the whiskey, every 2-3 months, and then towards the end, it's every month. And so they really start to accelerate the tasting of the whiskeys to ensure that it doesn't now extract too much wood, and that they can bottle it at its peak, if you will. And as you know, similar to Kentucky, where there's no air conditioning, obviously, in those in the warehouses. So barrels up top will age faster. Barrels below, they used to actually circulate all the barrels, but now they're getting too big to do that. So now they just have to really, really go up, taste, and ensure that they are doing, a perfect bottling at the perfect time. They have their own cooperage on staff, and so they do call it barrel repair, and they char their barrels to a level 3 char. So there's a bit more smokiness in the whiskey, and so that's really how they do it. Very, very hands-on. Their current warehouse only holds 5,000 barrels, so they manage those barrels carefully.
Thank you, Jane.
So I'm not. Does that make sense? I mean, it's the exact same process. It's just all of those other elements is what makes that whiskey so unique.
Sure. Do they ever use the new oak? It's more like ex-bourbon, ex-sherry, or export, whatever.
No, they use a combination of new oak and ex-bourbon. So the single malt is aged in a combination of both, and the peated, and then some of their other expressions. So they do use a combination of both. Yes.
Great. So that's a technical question. Now, question about Glass Revolution. You can share if you will, or if you can. Any more brands coming? Anything in the pipeline that you can share with us?
New brands?
Yeah.
We're looking at a few. We don't have nothing that I want to discuss right now, but we do have a couple of pretty exciting things that we're probably going to launch at the end of this year. Hopefully there's no delay because of what's going on. But yes, we are looking at a couple of exciting new little brands coming on board. But again, there'll be those kind of unique limited release products. So,
Sure.
Yeah. So stay tuned.
We will. Thank you.
Yeah.
Can I just chime in
we'll
here?
Let you know.
In regards to the questions he was having about distillation and aging in barrels. So like I'm sipping on the cask strength right now, and it's 61.8%. Is that the common? Is that just going to be this particular release, or is it every release of cask strength is going to be up there? Because for the age of the whiskey, it's a pretty high cask strength, and that's why I dig it. But
yeah. So what happens with the because of the evaporation in India, and if you think of it, because it's dry, so the air is dry. So what evaporates from the whiskey is actually water, whereas if your air is more humid, what evaporates, right, is alcohol. And then the alcohol in the barrel goes down, but in Amrut, their alcohol in the barrel goes up. So yes, cask strength is going to be that. They only do generally the two expressions, the single malt cask strength and the peated cask strength. And then on occasion, some of the limited releases like Atma will be a single cask at cask strength. Their sweet spot for bottling, what they found is at 50% or 100 proof. That's where they feel their sweet spot is for the most part. And so most of the limited expressions that they release are at 50%. I don't know if you noticed that, but that's kind of their sweet spot. They feel where it's drinkable without adding additional water, and the whiskey shows us at their best, basically. So yes, cask strength will always be high because of the fact that they lose more water than alcohol.
Nice. And then I think Robert had a question that he wanted to get in.
Yeah. Hey, Jane, thank you so much, by the way. This has been great. One of the questions that I always wanted to ask, and I meant to actually ask Ashok when he was here, and I always forget. So Indian independence starts in 1947, and Amrut becomes a distillery in 1948. Is there any correlation at all where, because obviously there were several years building up to the independence, everyone knew it was coming. And was it something that they purposely waited? I know this is kind of a really nerdy question that has no bearing on the whiskey and how it's made, but I'm super curious about that. Do you have any idea on that? And no worries if you don't. That's a crazy question.
No, initially they weren't supposed to be a distillery, and then I don't know what happened. Something happened with the grandfather that he started producing alcohol, but it wasn't for drinking purposes. It was for pharmaceutical purposes, and so he had to get a distillery license, and that was part of the initial beginning of that distillery. And at the time, it was not fairly easy to get a license, but it was easier than it would be now to get that same distillery license. So that was kind of the beginning of the distillery. So it wasn't really thought out, oh, we're going to be making rum and we're going to be doing this. That's why they didn't do it until, a number of years later.
Yeah. Yeah, I bet there's a little bit of a story there. We should prod Ashok one time and ask him about the family history if he knows it way back then.
Yeah, he may not, but if Rick comes over, he definitely would know it because Rick is the son. He's the third. He's the third generation, so he would definitely know the story, the full story. I got a little part of the story, but you know the full story.
I'm a storyteller, so I love digging deep into this stuff.
Can I ask?
All right. Well,
can I ask him?
Sure.
Hopefully, last question, and let you go, Jane. Thank you very much. We've done, many tasting demos with Amrut, and I remember in the beginning. Most of the people didn't even know of existence in India, and I understand because they first started exporting before it was available in India. Now more and more people during the tasting already know Amrut and they're looking for it, they taste it. But seems like the old port, nobody really knows. And I'm talking mostly Indian, of course, people, because they all know other rums that they've been drinking since,
like Old Monk,
you mentioned that Old Port started production in 1958. Is that also because it's been exported mostly, not available in India widely?
No, so Old Port rum actually is the 7th largest selling rum in the world, but most of it is sold in India. Yes. And so, they sell 1 million cases just in the state of Karnataka, which is the state that they're in. So it didn't come to market as quickly, definitely. It was a latecomer to market in terms of the Indian rum, as opposed to, say, Old Monk, which was in the export market first. And so that's possibly why it's not as well known, for sure. Was that the question?
Yeah, pretty much. I was just curious, how come everybody knows the Old Monk and nobody knows although it's pretty much at the same price level.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And
Well, I
Old
wonder,
Monk, if
yeah, I was just
you've
saying, like, Old Monk
tasted
has
both
the,
of them, you know they're quite different.
yeah, maybe Old Monk
Sorry,
because of like the
who's talking?
military connection or something. Because I know that's a big thing with their military.
And
And
Old Monk is made in the first distillery, right? That was in India, like that. The Brit established Dyer, and then they started making Old Monk. So it's been maybe more well known because of that. So that was even earlier than Old Port.
Old Monk started in 1935, and it started because of pressure from the
Yeah.
British colonists to get rum into the market.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. So
Awesome.
so if you think about it, like Old Port rum only, I mean, it really only hit the US 10 years ago. Right?
There's still lots
2010.
of building to
So,
do.
yeah, still lots of building to do.
Well, I mean, and I also think that, like there's certainly feelings that people have towards towards Old Monk, some positive, some negative, and it might be a scenario where that kind of like the Old Port gets lumped into the category of Indian whiskey because of people's impressions off of Old Monk, or I mean the Old Port for there. So maybe that there's some of that where
right.
hasn't built the same type of reputation. So, but yeah, well, I don't have any more questions. Does anybody else have any questions for Jane? We've kept her here for quite a while at this point.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed it. I hope you guys learned a little bit, hopefully. And
I learned a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, like this. Yeah, there's a lot of information here that I'm pretty stoked on. So, everybody, thank you so much. Thank you for weathering the storm that we went through at the very beginning. Val, I wish you were here for that because you would have loved it. We'll tell you about it later. And, ultimately these things are about offering us a little bit of escapism from the crappiness that's going on in the world today. And hopefully we'll be out of it soon. We'll be able to, hang out together, drink together, all that stuff. So stay healthy, stay safe. Cheers to everybody. Cheers to Jane. Thank you again so much. And
thank you so much for having me.
We'll be talking soon. All right.
All right.
All right. Have a good one.
Okay, thanks.